Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you're listening or watching from in the world. Welcome back to the Yout Turnt Show. With me, your guest host for today, Elizabeth Eloidy, sitting in for Romaine Redman. Now remember, this is where we aim to inform, empower, and energize the youth across the world. For those who were tuned in last time and are here again this week, welcome back. For those joining us for the first time today, a big welcome to you. Now, the Yout Turnt Show airs live on Saturdays at 3 p.m. to 4 p.m. right here on GBKM FM. So you can also join us in on the conversation on our platforms. You can join in on Facebook at GBKM Television. You can join us on YouTube at GBKM TV. Our website is www.gbkm.fm. Or if you have the tuning app, you can check us out at GBKM, where you can take us everywhere with you on the go. Now, just to let you know about our sponsor, the Yout Turnt Show is brought to you by the AOF Immigration Canada. They specialize in all your immigration needs, ranging from permanent residency, caregiver programs, business visitor visas, student visa program, a temporary worker program, and so much more. So you can contact AOF Immigration Canada today for your private and confidential consultation. You can either call at 416-629-4617. That's 416-629-4617. You can also email at info@aofimmigration.com. That's info@aofimmigration.com. Or you can pay them a visit, of course, safely. It's Unit 20 at 5800 Ambler Drive in Mississauga, Ontario. And let them know that the Yout Turnt Show sent you. Now, last time on the show, we presented our final installment in the series, Reset, Get Ready to Go, as we talked youth homelessness. Now, today we will continue this discussion, but from a solution-oriented angle on an issue that is all too relevant and urgent. And of course, my guest here today will help me with this discussion, so stay tuned, and we will be right back after this short break.
Hello, my name is Ryan Knight, the co-founder and executive director of the Afro-Caribbean Business Network Foundation. I am here excited to announce the new microloan program that we have put together. With the support of Alterna Savings Credit Union and the partnership of SETC, Empowered Forex, and the Dream Legacy Foundation, we're going to be helping more entrepreneurs of African and Caribbean heritage get access to funding and help with their grant writing. Please visit our website, acbncanada.com, to learn more if you're an entrepreneur that's in need of funding.
Welcome back to the Yout Turnt Show. If you are just joining us, I'm your guest host for today, Elizabeth Eloidy, sitting in for our usual host, Romaine Redman, and we are locked in for the hour from 3 p.m. to 4 p.m. right here on GBKM FM. So let's jump right into today's show. So there is no doubt, as the ballooning house market in Ontario has found itself in the last 2 decades. Essentially, the housing market has priced many hardworking families out of affording homes, and folks struggle to even make rent. Not to mention practices that keep deepening the inequalities which exist in our society today. Now, today on the Yout Turnt Show, we will explore the Ontario NDP's plan to get you homes you can afford. So please help me welcome our very special guest, Deputy Leader of the Ontario NDP, Housing Critic and MPP for Brampton Centre, Sarah Singh. Welcome to the show, Sarah. Sorry, Sarah, we're just going to have you unmute yourself real quick.
Okay, so let's try that again. You gotta love technology, eh? Well, it's great to be here with you, Elizabeth. Thank you so much for having me on today.
Thank you so much for being on today. Now, we know that you have been in the thick of, executing your duties as an elected representative, but how have you been throughout this pandemic? I think we've all been handling it a little differently. Can you tell us a little bit about what your experience has been these last 9 months?
Well, I think for everyone, COVID-19 has impacted them differently. For us here in Brampton Center, for our office, we have been very busy. I think, a lot of people are facing different challenges. So our office has been managing all sorts of different calls, a lot of calls from people related to housing, especially from renters who are concerned about potential evictions, and we can certainly chat about that. But on a personal level, I've been good, just trying to stay healthy and stay positive and keep the community motivated to, follow public health measures, but find real solutions to some of the problems that have been coming up over the last couple of months.
Definitely. I think that, finding some positivity and ray of sunshine during these times is so important to keep our moods elevated and staying focused as well. Now, without a doubt, I think we both understand that the situation that has engulfed the Ontario's housing market has been quite large, especially during this pandemic. And one of the sad realities is that young people, equity-seeking groups, and folks that are at the lower end of the socioeconomic ladder are suffering the most. I mean, you mentioned folks, especially during this pandemic, dealing with rent issues, even mortgage payments as well. Now, to what degree would you say that this proposal would be for those individuals specifically?
Great question. I think what we put forward with our Homes You Can Afford plan, it helps to address some of the underlying problems we see that are contributing to the housing crisis here in the province of Ontario. Let's be honest, we had a housing crisis before COVID-19, and when COVID-19 hit, it really ravaged through a lot of communities and disproportionately impacted, people from lower socioeconomic groups. That's why we see certain communities sort of managing hotspots in those regions as well. And so what we are putting forward is a plan to try to address, the backlog in access to housing, making sure that renters have additional supports to stay in their units longer, not face, above guideline rent increases, but also help people finally afford a home. So there's a whole spectrum of proposals we put together in our Homes You Can Afford plan that seek to address the sort of wide-ranging issues we find in our housing market, whether that's a tenant trying to make sure that they can make ends meet, or somebody trying to make sure that they can afford the mortgage payments in a community like Brampton, right?
Yeah. I mean, I think, as a millennial, we hear the conversation constantly. If you're a millennial, maybe you shouldn't spend money on that cup of coffee and instead save towards your home, and maybe you can afford to purchase a home. And you hear the conversations amongst yourselves as well, like, I don't know if I can afford to purchase a home under the current climate. So would you say that this proposal, that the Homes You Can Afford proposal, is really to help, future generations become more secure when it comes to housing, especially?
Absolutely. When we look at the millennial generation, we find ourselves in a bit of a tough spot where, our incomes are for the most part stagnant. The costs of living are going up. So it's getting even harder and harder to save towards a down payment. And, for many of us who are fortunate enough, we have to rely on, for example, the bank of mom and dad to help with that down payment. So what we actually put forward in our plan is something to help address the, sort of growing barrier for young people and new immigrants, for example, and pretty much anyone, seeking to buy their first home. We created a Home in Ontario plan that would provide folks up to 10% of the value of their home through an equity line sort of mortgage down payment that we would be helping with. So up to 10% of the value of your home, we would help provide you that equity loan to help with the down payment on purchasing. So that's a significant amount for some people who might be struggling to come up with the money for a down payment, because not only is it about qualifying for the mortgage, it's about having those savings in place to help access the capital you need to buy a home. So that's one of the proposals we put forward. But as you point out, I mean, this is a larger conversation about making sure that the cost of living is being addressed, and that folks can keep more of the income that they are earning, and make sure that it can be put towards things like purchasing your first home. So it's not just about one policy, but this is about really having a more holistic look at how young people and first-time home buyers can access the market.
Yeah. Now, speaking of the more holistic look, we're going to take a deeper dive into the Homes You Can Afford proposal. And one of the points that was addressed was making renting more affordable and giving renters more security. Now, and one thing that was mentioned was real rent control. Now, what does the ONDP mean by real rent control?
So, what we saw with the Conservative government was them scrapping measures that would, ensure that rent wasn't being increased at an unfair level. Mm-hmm. Or in many instances, we find that tenants are being evicted unfairly in what we call rent evictions. And the rents are just jacked up to the point where that tenant can no longer afford it. Yeah. And so we want to end those types of practices because often tenants are put into a place where the rent is increased above the guidelines that are in place, but often they're also forced out of their homes. And when we think of, for example, seniors who may have been in a unit for many years, this is their home, this is their community. If a landlord forces them out in order to increase the rents, that's a senior that may become homeless, may not have access to shelter. So it contributes to a larger societal problem. So through our vacancy decontrol measures, we want to put pressure on the market to ensure that people aren't unnecessarily being pushed out of their homes, but that also those rents aren't being increased in an unfair way either. And these measures have worked in other provinces as well to help cool the market down a bit, and to help regulate and ensure, again, people have access to safe and affordable places to call home.
Mm-hmm. Now, speaking of the vacancy decontrols as well, I mean, there are fears that it will have effects on the rental market, which might see landlords not doing upgrades or making up in amenity charges. Will there be rules put in place to ensure that these fears are not realized and there will be more security on, both ends?
Absolutely. I think that's a part of the challenge, and something that we are ready to take on is finding a way that we can create a balance system. And I think, ensuring that landlords have supports as well, and that their needs are recognized is important. This isn't about, one or the other. I think that both landlords and tenants play a really important role in securing our housing market. And looking at things like reforming the landlord-tenant board so that things can be done in a more expeditious manner, that people can actually move forward through that process are also measures that we are proposing, so that, again, we can have a more balanced system. Because in some instances, landlords do need to make these renovations. They do need to recoup costs, and that is also understandable. The measures we're proposing are really to help target some of those bad faith landlords, the large corporations where we know they don't do repairs for decades. They're unfairly increasing rents on tenants, vulnerable tenants often, and, evicting mainly vulnerable tenants, again, in order to jack up those rates to market level. So it's about, again, creating a system that's more equitable and fair for everyone, but really making sure that those bad actors aren't able to get away with the things that they've been doing.
Mm-hmm. Now, also outlined is not just for renters, it's also home buyers as well. Part of it, making it easier to buy a home, which we kind of touched on a little earlier, and strengthening home buyers' protections. Now, your Home in Ontario plan, how would you say that differs from the federal government's first-time home buyer incentive program, which we know provides 5 to 10% down payment? You mentioned that there would be a 10% equity line as well provided to those who are trying to purchase their first home. What other differences might we see that would help provide more security for first-time home buyers that might differ from the federal government's plan?
That's an excellent question, Elizabeth, and thanks so much for it. So the differences between our plan and what the federal government does is these would actually be two programs you would be able to apply to simultaneously. So the federal government, what they do is provide assistance with first-time home buyers and your land transfer tax. So you're not paying the entire amount when you qualify for the first-time home buyers incentive, which can be a significant savings for some people. We're talking a couple $1,000 in most instances as a first-time home buyer. So that is a wonderful program that we really encourage first-time home buyers to take advantage of, so that you aren't paying the full amount of your land transfer tax as well. But what our program seeks to do is, in addition to that, would help folks with a 10% equity loan, essentially, that would be to the value of their home. And this would be a loan that you could apply towards your down payment and would not have to pay back until you sold your home, or if you chose to pay it back on your own, that's also welcome. So these are two different programs that, again, help to just address some of the barriers that especially first-time home buyers face. And so whether that's coming up with the additional funds to help with some of those costs, like your land transfer tax, or helping with that down payment, every little bit adds up. And so hopefully these programs in tandem can help people access the market more effectively.
And how would that also work for immigrants who are also looking to purchase their first home as well?
Absolutely. This program is geared towards new immigrants, young families, single people, folks that usually struggle with getting, again, access to the capital that they need to secure a down payment, to qualify for a mortgage. And that's what we want to try to help with, because, it shouldn't just be people who are earning, two incomes and have that sort of level of security that should be able to realize the dream of home ownership. We really do truly want to make that more accessible to people. And this is one aspect of it too. I think when you look at our plan in terms of things like inclusionary zoning and ensuring that there is actually affordable housing being built. And when we say affordable housing, that isn't just social housing. We're talking about actual homes that people can afford at a reasonable market rate. And so there are many tools that we have within our plan that hopefully will help us create a market where it is more accessible for everyone to be able to realize that dream.
Mm-hmm. Now, speaking of, the dream of owning a home, people say that it's a luxury, it's a privilege, and it should be afforded to those who can afford it. And speaking of those who can afford it, billionaires and millionaires often invest in real estate. And then we find that they will invest in real estate and leave it vacant. And part of this plan also is about tackling, quote unquote, greedy billionaires, speculators, flippers, and bad developers to cool the market. Could you talk a little bit more about that and break that down for us?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, again, an excellent question, because this is one of the major sort of drivers of sort of speculation within our housing market that is contributing to these high prices that we see. We saw this a lot in Toronto, but we see this happening more and more in the suburbs as well, where we have foreign buyers or, large corporations, again, buying up tracts of real estate and pricing people out of the market. And so what we're proposing to do is actually put a tax on that. So that those dollars can help us generate revenue and, again, create access to housing that is affordable for people, but also hopefully prevent some of this activity from happening, where you do have foreign buyers, coming in, creating bidding wars on properties, pricing out locals, pricing out millennials, that are really struggling to gain access to the market. So these measures, a vacancy speculation tax, as well as a money laundering tax, is going to help us, target that risky behavior that is contributing to some of the problems that we see, but also, again, generate the revenue we need for some of the programs that are absolutely fundamental, whether that's to address homelessness or, again, create affordable housing stock. We see programs like this work really well. BC has had a vacancy tax in place, and that has helped create, one, access to units, but two, help stop some of that speculation in the housing market as well. And so if elected, that's something that we are going to propose to do here as well. And hopefully that will help us get some regulation and control in the market as well, but on the plus side, generate revenues that we need to.
Now, another side of that is also folks part of the Indigenous community as well, or the BIPOC community. And one of the proposed plans is by Indigenous Housing for Indigenous strategy. Yeah, I'd love for you to break that down for us as well, just because I think it's important that we remember that there is an Indigenous community who are often, forgotten when we're thinking about certain things, especially when it comes to housing and housing structures as well.
No, absolutely. And this is a really important part of our plan. Just recently, we heard that the federal government was going to develop a strategy around recognizing the United Nations Declaration for Indigenous People and the UNDRIP sort of framework being implemented here. And I think it's very important that we do that not only at a federal level, but at a provincial level as well. As First Nations people, all of us are settlers to this land. But unfortunately, in many of those nations in their territories, they haven't received the supports that they deserve, both from the federal and provincial governments, which have meant that the infrastructure that they need to sustain their people hasn't been there. And so when we think of housing, that infrastructure is either very in a state of disrepair, or it is simply unsafe for many people because it was built decades ago, and many of these communities are so off reserve that it's very difficult to access. Actually, I work very closely with our colleague Saul Mamakwa, who is from the First Nations community and the riding of Quitnung, and housing is one of the things him and I discuss quite often because the housing there is not like what we have here at all. In many of his communities, there is actually no running water. So when you think of basic infrastructure, and those elements are just not present in many First Nations communities. And that's why we're proposing not to impose development on those communities, but work with them to find solutions and to develop the housing that they need in a way that's actually effective. When we think of systemic racism and when we talk about BIPOC communities, when we look at what's happened to our Indigenous communities, the impacts of colonization are still felt to this day. And it honestly is until you really fully see these images and understand what's happening there, you wouldn't believe that in 2020, within the province of Ontario and this country of Canada, that people are still forced to live in the conditions that they are. And that's why, again, we want to try to address this because it's been something that's been so neglected by previous governments that it's, I think, time that we do start to really move in that direction. I think truth and reconciliation won't be possible if we don't even provide basic infrastructure to people.
And, part of truth and reconciliation is addressing the truth and what's really going on. Yeah. Absolutely.
And, there is a housing crisis. I mean, again, when you talk about what some people, First Nations members are dealing with in their territories, it's shocking. And again, it's because they aren't getting access to the supports that they deserve and they rightfully are entitled to as treaty people as well. So yeah, in our plan, we really do hope to address that and again, work with Indigenous and First Nations communities to ensure that those rights are realized.
Now, this is a plan, to be put into effect, but what is the timeline that we're looking at here for folks who are probably wondering, like, this sounds great, but when can we, if elected, see these changes being made?
So I think that's the caveat, right, is we need to get elected to make some of this change happen. And the only way we can implement some of these strategies is to form government in 2022. And so we want to encourage people to learn more about the NDP, learn more about what we're proposing, because what we've seen from this government, unfortunately, this Conservative government, is a lot of cuts to our housing sector, cuts to programs that would support folks that are facing homelessness. But these are areas, as we've seen through COVID, that we need to be investing in. We can't make it easier for people to be evicted and put out onto the streets. That isn't going to help our housing crisis. It isn't a good policy to hand the keys over to developers to make massive profits off our housing market while people are priced out of opportunities to have safe places to live. So we want to try to address that. And it's important to acknowledge that we didn't get here overnight, right? This is because of years and years of neglect, decades of neglect, actually. Even under the Liberal government, we saw them fail to actually invest in housing and create the housing stock that we need to. So it's not going to be fixed overnight either. And I think that's really important. And I'm very realistic with people about that. It will take time to make the investments to create the housing supply and stock that we need to. But we have to start. We can't pretend that that problem doesn't exist. And the longer that governments do sort of not take action, the bigger this problem is going to get. And we're going to continue to see the impacts of that for generations and generations to come, as we are now. We're really seeing the crisis unfold in terms of housing. But again, decades of neglect is what got us here. So I'm hopeful that when we form government, we can at least start to tackle some of these problems so that we can, at the end of the day, I just want to also point out, when we make these investments, we save money down the road in other systems. So I think that's really important from a fiscal perspective and an economics perspective. When we make these investments in housing, we actually boost our GDP. We can help contribute to the tax base, and we can help generate revenues that we need to, but also save in terms of impacts to healthcare. Housing helps people, address those social determinants of health, and that helps us as a society as well. So I know that's sort of a big answer to that question, but I think it's important that we understand housing is a real important investment in terms of the government and the role that we play.
Yeah, and I think that's a question that is raised in a lot of folks' mind is, how are we going to afford this? How are we going to pay for this? And it's always a worry that, it would be coming straight out of, our pockets, if you will, quote unquote.
Absolutely. But I think when we think of the housing sector, it's not just about building, quote unquote, social housing, but it's actually about making sure people can stay housed, right? And again, that saves money. If somebody ends up homeless, there's cost to the system for that. But if we were able to keep that person housed, we're saving healthcare dollars, we're saving social assistance dollars, and that person can actually, live out a meaningful life in a way and contribute to society in a different way. So I think if we view the issue a little bit differently and frame the solution differently, we can actually, again, like I said, I think, not only generate revenues, but help address some of the pressures on some of those systems that we know are overburdened to begin with. And I think, that housing first model is really important because understanding that if people have access to housing, they can then access the other systems that they need to. But without housing, they can't do any of that. So it's really important that we do. We can afford to do it. I think that's important too. And that's where something like a speculation tax comes into place, right? When we know that these are some of the mechanisms that are putting pressure on the system, if we can tax that behavior to help us generate the revenues to create these programs or create social housing, that makes sense as well. And let's not forget, when people have access to a home, they also help contribute to our local property tax base as well. So there's so many benefits to having people housed in safe and affordable housing. That maybe we won't be able to get into all of them today, but that's why I encourage people to read the plan. But to think of this as an investment. Housing has helped us get out of recessions before, and I hope that the government, and when we form government, we will continue to make sure we make those investments to help us move forward through the economy as well.
Right. Now, speaking of, homelessness and the homelessness population dealing with the pandemic currently, how would you say that this Homes You Can Afford proposal would help dealing with that? Essentially, it's a crisis at this point.
It absolutely is a crisis. And in different communities, that crisis is felt very differently. When you look at what homelessness looks like in Toronto versus, let's say, what homelessness will feel like for somebody in Sudbury or in Windsor, it's going to be a very different impact. So what we've proposed to do is help boost some of the emergency shelter capacity throughout the province and addressing some of the backlogs. Again, I think it's really important to understand some of these investments haven't haven't been made for decades. So we're already starting so far behind and that these investments are going to need to be, record breaking in order for us to catch up to a point where we need to. But again, it's not just about making sure people have access to shelter when they've reached a crisis place. It's about making sure they don't get to a crisis place in the first place. And that means boosting the supply of affordable housing options, whether that's affordable rentals or, again, making sure people can access a home and then potentially create a rental opportunity out of that for somebody. It's really important that it isn't just looked at in terms of, we need to create social housing supports. No, I think we need to look at how to create housing supports, period, for people so that they don't get to the point of crisis. Because it is getting worse. And for some people in many communities, like, for example, in Peel and Brampton, folks are waiting 12, 13 years to access the social housing units. That problem isn't going to get fixed overnight. So how do we, create stock in the market for almost immediately? So that's one of the reasons that we proposed our Residents' Right Act that would help people convert, let's say, parts of their home into a rental unit to help somebody get access to that while, let's say, other buildings are being built and other spaces are being constructed. So again, it's going to take just looking at the problem a little differently and understanding that folks get to a state of homelessness because all those other supports weren't in place. And so rather than just trying to support somebody once they've reached the state of homelessness, how do we prevent that from happening at all?
And they do say that prevention is the key to dealing with any problem, right? On that note, we're just going to take a quick break, and when we're back, we're going to continue our conversation with MPP Sarah Singh on homes you can afford. Stay tuned.
The Amazon Superflyer is a digital flyer that was built to make it easy and convenient for you to acquire any products you need on Amazon. It is designed to allow you to touch or click the photo of the product you wish to purchase without searching or navigating to find it. Let me show you just how easy it is to use. This is how you use the Amazon Superflyer Pharmacy Edition. You can come down here to an item that you wish to purchase, like this mask right here, and if you click on it, it'll take you right to Amazon, so you can add it to your cart or buy it immediately, and also use your Amazon account for the purchase. Amazon handles the shipping, Amazon handles the payment processing. All you do is add it to your cart and buy it immediately, just with a touch or with a click. It also has 6 pages of items that you might wish to purchase in different departments. Along the side, if there's an item that you don't see that you'd like to purchase, then you can go to the link here on the right, click on that link. It'll bring you immediately into the full universe of masks that are available at Amazon. You can pull up a page like the children's page, scroll down to get cough, cold, and flu medicines, thermometers, juice boxes, or any other types of items that you might want for your child. With the Amazon Superflyer, you can be just a
Hello and welcome back to the Yout Turnt show. Here with me, your guest host for today, Elizabeth Aloyde, sitting in for Romaine Redman. And I am joined here today by MPP Sarah Singh of Brampton Centre as we discuss the ONDP's Homes You Can Afford proposal. Now, before we went on the break, we were discussing the proposed plan to help with the homelessness crisis currently that we're seeing, even especially in the province. But also part of that as well is the security for survivors as well, a safe place to go. As we know, there are certain youth who grow up in group homes or even foster care, and once they reach the age of majority, 18, they are often kicked out and left to fend for themselves, and providing a source of security for them to know that they have a way to land on their feet. In the proposal, under the Give Survivors a Safe Place to Go, what would that essentially look like for survivors?
So, I think for a lot of young people and, in particular, potentially women who are fleeing domestic abuse, there's an understanding that there needs to be additional supports in place to help ensure that folks can secure housing. Again, as we were discussing earlier, Housing First really understands that if you are in a safe place to call home, all of those other social determinants of health should be able to fall in place. So that's why we're proposing just making sure that there are additional mechanisms to make sure people are not falling through the cracks as they transition out of care into adulthood, and making sure that those wraparound supports are there for folks. And that means, again, ensuring that there's emergency shelter capacity, that there's emergency housing capacity, that there is investments being made in social and affordable housing. All of these, again, come together to help make sure that everybody has a safe place they can call home.
Which is so important. Now, I want to kind of return back to renting and rent freeze that was proposed for 2021 as part of the Government of Ontario that passed legislation to freeze rent at 2020 levels. What this essentially means for those who are watching from home is that rent will not increase in 2021 for the vast majority of rented units covered under the Residential Tenancy Act. So the rent freeze would apply to most tenants living in rented houses, apartments, and condos, basement apartments, even care homes, mobile home parks, land lease communities, affordable housing units. How would you say that this plan may be similar or differ to the plans proposed in the affordable homes proposal?
Great. So for us, I think, the big thing is actually, New Democrats really pushed for this rent freeze, and we're glad that the government did put this in place. And it's important that we do, because as we discussed, more and more people are finding themselves out of work right now. More and more people are unable to manage the rising costs of living, and that's everything from our rent to food to everything in between is going up. And so what a rent freeze helps do is just help stabilize things for folks so that they aren't being hit with unexpected rent increases, which is something we were seeing pre-pandemic happen quite often, to the point where people were again forced out of their homes or rental units because the rents were being increased at an unfair rate. So hopefully this helps ensure that people are not hit with unnecessary rental increases that are above rental market rates, and that hopefully they can stay in their homes. But I just want to point out that while there's a rent freeze in place, there isn't necessarily an eviction ban in place. And that's really concerning to us as New Democrats, because that hasn't necessarily stopped landlords from, serving eviction notices to their tenants and creating this fear of, losing your home, again, whether that's a rental or not, for people. And so if we don't have in tandem with the rent freeze and eviction ban in place, people are being forced out of their home, even though the rent might not go up, because they simply don't have an income to help pay the rent. So it's a good measure, but a lot more needs to be done, and that's something that we've been pushing for. So not only does there need to be a rent freeze, but there needs to be an eviction plan for as long as this pandemic is lasting. But unfortunately, the government hasn't moved in that direction. In fact, they made changes through Bill 184, and I encourage people to learn more about that, that will actually make it easier for people to be evicted throughout this pandemic, rather than harder, or to help prevent that from happening at all.
Mm-hmm. And that's something that, especially throughout this pandemic, has been a raised issue for a lot of folks, not just even in Ontario, not just in Canada, but across the world, is that we're seeing so many people who haven't been able to pay their rent, and they're fearing eviction, and there are long lines at the courts trying to fight evictions, and we're not seeing so much being done about it. How realistic, in your view, would it be to see a solution come about for these evictions?
Well, I think there's a few different ways that this can be, approached, and I think that, again, it shows us that the government hasn't really fully understood the problem. Mm-hmm. In addition to helping provide direct supports, income supports to many of those tenants, we've proposed things like a rent bank for landlords as well, so that landlords can apply directly to help offset the costs that they're incurring as well. Because even though there's been some federal support, you think of $2,000 a month is what the federal government has provided, and so at a provincial level, that's all someone has been qualifying for. Market rates in Toronto are well above $2,000 a month, and so it's simply not enough. So a lot of people are sort of forced, to choose between, do I pay the rent or do I eat this month, right? And that's becoming harder and harder, and that's why again we propose that the provincial government provide a higher, income support, emergency income support measures, also help with rent banks as well to help, again, directly to the landlord or to the tenant to help pay that rent. Just simply having a blanket, universal income there doesn't help with all those costs that people are incurring, especially if they're not working. So it is realistic that it can be addressed. I think, again, if you stop the evictions, you won't have folks, backlogging the courts right now. I think where evictions need to happen, there is a process in place. In some instances, of course, we do understand that these do need to be brought forward to a tribunal or hearing process to have these matters resolved, and that should be happening. But again, to change legislation, to change mechanisms, to make it harder for, for example, folks to appear at hearings and be brought forward and through the eviction process, this government has made it easier to get tenants out of their homes rather than keep them safe when there are measures to help protect both the landlord and the tenant.
And part of the proposal is really strengthening the landlord and tenant board as well. Could you expand on that a little bit more for us?
Absolutely. So what we see and what's contributed to a huge backlog at the landlord tenant board is that, even the previous Liberal government and this Conservative government haven't hired enough adjudicators, for example, to hear those cases. And that has contributed to a lot of people just facing delays and those costs just piling up for folks. And so that is why we are proposing that we hire those adjudicators. We transform the way that the landlord tenant board operates, bring it into sort of the modern era so that folks can get access, but also, change the rules that sort of favors large scale corporations over, the tenant. I think that's important, but also create, mechanisms to help landlords navigate the system as well as tenants, help them understand what their rights are. Those are some of the proposals we've put forward so that, again, people can have access to timely hearings and that they also aren't being unnecessarily burdened with, the processes of the landlord tenant board. That's what we hear so often from people, is that the process of, paperwork that's required, the costs that are associated with going through the LTB, it's just, it's not manageable for most people. So how do we create a system that's going to, again, do what it's meant to do and help protect tenants and landlords at the same time?
So then you would say that this is really about both sides. It's not one-sided, that some people might feel that, you might be favoring tenants over landlords, and landlords also have rent bills to pay, and they use the rent money to pay their bills, which is an argument that I personally hear all too often when we're speaking of home insecurity and the rent increases and even evictions, where landlords are like, well, we need to evict people that aren't paying their rent because we too have a mortgage to pay, we too have bills to pay, and this is part of our livelihood as well.
Absolutely, and I think that's a really important distinction. It's not just about favoring one over the other. It is about making the system more fair, because at the end of the day, there are great landlords and there are great tenants, but there are also bad landlords and there are bad tenants. And so it isn't about rewarding one or the other. It's about making sure that everyone has access to a system, and that at the end of the day, it's ruling in a just way. But changing the rules to favor one over the other is also not fair. Because it doesn't benefit anyone when that happens. And I hear it all the time from landlords who are very frustrated by the system because they are spending, thousands of dollars trying to navigate it, and same for tenants. So again, there is a way to create a system that is more effective and efficient and make sure that it's balanced. And I also just want to say it's important to distinguish between, the large scale corporate landlords, who are walking away with billions and millions of dollars of profits, versus, a small landlord who is renting out a part of their home in order to sustain their mortgage. Those are very different types of landlords, and they have very different needs. And so we shouldn't be rewarding those large corporate landlords through the system, which is currently what's happening, and then punishing those small scale landlords who are really just trying to make ends meet. So I think if we distinguish between those landlords, we make sure they're protected on both ends, that's how we're going to create that balance that we need to see through the landlord tenant board. But it's clear it's not working, and it needs to be reformed, and we need to start to address that in order to try to create a balanced system. Neglecting the system isn't going to, if we know it's not working and just leaving it as is or tinkering it to favor one group over the other, that's also not the right approach. And that's kind of what this government has done. And that's why we're proposing to change the way that it operates, change the way that it functions, so that everyone can benefit at the end of the day.
And I would just love to hear from you to kind of reiterate how this proposal would plan to tackle, those commercial real estaters who are taking advantage of the system, as opposed to, hindering, the smaller renters who are just renting out a basement apartment to, as you say, help with their mortgage.
Yeah, absolutely. When we think of those like large corporate landlords, they're really the ones that are engaging in those bad faith rent evictions, for example. They're the ones that are oftentimes, doing the above guideline rent increases, and those are really concerning. So there are certain measures that we've put in place that would prevent that type of activity from happening. But also at the end of the day, we've put in place our Residents' Rights Act, which would help some of those smaller scale landlords with making sure that they have access to, funds to create those rental spaces in their homes, for example, but help them know that they have rights in place if they need to address problematic tenants as well. So I think that what we're hoping to do is, again, address the bad actors and reward the good ones, because that's the only way we're going to help address the housing crisis at the end of the day. If we don't address those people that are taking advantage of it, generating massive profits off of housing, then at the end of the day, we can't help those that are just trying to make ends meet as well. So the plan from a sort of spectrum perspective hopes to address, again, those bad actors and reward the good ones at the end of the day.
Now, I want to kind of get into rent increase especially, just because, we hear of landlords who evict their tenants just to increase the rent. How does this proposal then tackle that issue as well?
So what we're proposing to do is actually ban rent evictions from happening, because at the end of the day, landlords, some bad faith landlords are using these mechanisms to evict their tenants, and they say things like, oh, we're going to make these repairs, but those repairs never happen, and then the tenant isn't permitted to have access to that unit unless they're going to pay the increase, which for somebody may be the difference between having a home and not having a home at the end of the day. And so through some of the measures that we've proposed, we would stop that type of activity from taking place. If someone is going to renovate the unit, that they do provide that tenant the opportunity to move back into that unit within a fair and reasonable sort of increase if there was going to be one. And again, those measures will help to address those bad landlords that are engaging in this behavior. There are many good landlords who understand they need to make repairs in a timely manner, and haven't been doing those types of practices. It really is a pocket of people that are engaging in that type of behavior. So with targeted measures, hopefully we can stop those practices and make sure that people aren't being forced out of their homes into, again, maybe potentially an unsafe environment, one that doesn't meet their needs and is maybe unaffordable. So again, I think we can work together with landlords and those tenants to help keep people housed, but make sure that everyone has access to the market as they need to.
Now, before we let you go, I just want you to take the opportunity to, I think, just reiterate what is the one thing that you want people to take away from this particular proposal when it comes to the plan for tackling housing insecurity.
Thanks. No, this has been a real treat to chat with you, Elizabeth, and I really appreciate the opportunity. And I think for everyone that's watching, I just really encourage you to take a look at our plan to learn more about this, because we do want to try to address, the housing crisis here in the province of Ontario, one that is continuing to get worse as we navigate a global pandemic as well. And I think more now than ever, we need to take bold and progressive approaches to addressing these problems in our province, and that's what we're hoping to do. So whether that's making sure that somebody who is renting can do so in a more accessible way, or making sure that somebody can purchase their first home, we really want to try to help make sure that everyone has a safe and affordable place to call home. After all, it is our human right to have access to housing, and I think through this plan we're going to address some of the neglect we've seen in the system, but start to proactively ensure that everyone has access to a place to call home.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, MPP Singh, for joining us on the Yout Turnt show today. And we look forward to having you back in the future.
Absolutely. This was it was a great conversation. I really appreciate it. And again, if anyone watching wants to ask any other questions, don't hesitate to get in touch. A quick Google, you'll get all of our contact details. And I'm sure they'll maybe go up on the screen. But thanks again for having me on. I really enjoyed our conversation.
Great. We'd just like to hear from you specifically, like how folks can get in touch, just in case as well.
For sure. So you can reach out to us. Our phone number is 905-454-1233. Our email is sing.co@ndp.on.ca. You can always visit the Ontario NDP website to check out not only our homes you can afford plan, but so many other proactive policies.
Could you speak up first? Sorry, we just lost you there, Sarah.
Sorry, I was just going to say, I don't know where we got lost, but yeah, you can always visit the Ontario NDP website to learn more, not only about our homes you can afford plan, but all of the other good work we're trying to do for the province of Ontario.
Great. Thank you so much for joining us. So what a great discussion we've had today. For those of who's tuned in, thank you so much for joining us on the Yout Turnt show. MPP Sarah Singh, our deputy leader of the Ontario NDP housing critic and MPP for Brampton Centre. Thank you so much for joining us and joining in with this conversation today for the ONDP Homes You Can Afford proposal. If you have just joined and you happen to miss the discussion, no worries. You can catch up and listen and tune in on the past shows on our website at www.gbkm.fm. If you want to get in on what we were discussing today on the Yout Turnt show, you can also check out the videos on Facebook at GBKM Television and YouTube at GBKM TV. And again, catching the recaps on our website at www.gbkm.fm. And exciting news, we have an app that is soon coming, so make sure you look out and watch out for our official GBKM app where you can take us on the go everywhere we go. But for that, you can continue to catch up with us on our various platforms, again on Facebook at GBKM Television, on YouTube at GBKM TV, our website www.gbkm.fm, or you can check out www.gbkm.tv, or of course on the TuneIn app at GBKM. And again, thank you to our sponsor, AOF Immigration Canada, and our amazing team, our amazing production team. And thank you so much for watching and listening each week. Do not forget to drop us a like, some comments, and of course share this with your friends so they too can join in on the weekly conversations that we have and that Romaine will be back having. Don't worry, you won't see my face again next week. You will have your regular host. And with that, see you next week.
Hello, my name is Ryan Knight, the co-founder and executive director of the Afro-Caribbean Business Network Foundation. I am here excited to announce the new microloan program that we have put together. With the support of Alterna Savings Credit Union and the partnership of SETC, Empowered Forex, and the Dream Legacy Foundation, we're going to be helping more entrepreneurs of African and Caribbean heritage get access to funding and help with their grant writing. Please visit our website, acbncanada.com, to learn more if you're an entrepreneur that's in need of funding, or if you would love